We are at the Marxe Talks, and our topic this evening is the perfect voting storm, how COVID-19, strict ID requirements, and partisanship are threatening the right to vote. I'm Nicole Gordon. I'm the faculty director of the Executive Master's Program in Administration at the Marxe School. And I am very pleased to introduce our moderator slash panelist, because he's deeply, deeply knowledgeable about these subjects. And we're really very happy to have him here. He traveled literally with the speed of light to be here from Massachusetts, where he is a distinguished professor of political science at MIT. And without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to him, and we will get started. Thank you, Charles.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And it's great to be on this webinar today, and it's great to be virtually in New York. It would be nice to actually be in New York, but here we are. And so it's going to be a good program, I think. The run of the show will be that the various panelists will introduce themselves and have a few things to say about the topics on hand. We have your questions already, a few questions already that have been submitted, and during the comment time, if folks want to ask other questions, please do so in the chat, and we'll try to monitor that. Then we'll throw things open at 6:45 for a bit more of an open discussion, depending on how things go. And so with that, I think the order here will, Sonia Jarvis will begin, and then Don, Nicole, and I will clean up, and then we'll have a general discussion, and then move on to the questions. So I believe Sonia was going to start, so she's going to introduce herself, and then get us going. Sonia? Sonia, you're on. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, Charles.
Hi there.
Ready for me to go?
Ready to go.
Well, to our audience, thank you all for joining us today to give us an opportunity to talk about some work we've been doing on the issue of voter ID, but more specifically to talk about this historical moment and how we should be approaching it with a presidential election in less than 100 days, along with a worldwide pandemic, which we have not handled well as a nation. At the same time, we're also doing our decennial census that we do every 10 years. And somehow we're supposed to figure out steps forward in the aftermath of 61 days of protests following the death of George Floyd. And so what I'm going to try to do to start us off is to give some context for each of these pieces, and how do we understand what's going on, and what can we do to prepare for the elections that will be on November 3rd. We can look at this upcoming election through the prism of the last 20 years. The last time we had one of our most closely contested elections was in the year 2000. And we're 20 years away from that. And some of the challenges we're facing now are a direct result of that election. As some of you may remember, and those of you may have heard, the election came down to the state of Florida in the contest between Vice President Al Gore and former Governor George Bush. And because of a number of problems with respect to election administration, but also a number of other issues that we will get to over the course of this discussion, there was real confusion about who had actually won, and the state of Florida was the key to determining that result. Now, normally when there's a contested election, we wait until all the votes are counted. That did not happen in 2000. And one of the reasons it did not happen was that the Supreme Court elected to interject itself, in my judgment, sooner than it needed to, and on a 5-4 basis came up with a brand new constitutional right that no one had ever heard of. And they told us in the opinion we can't use it again. And against that backdrop, we then had Al Gore concede the election to George Bush, and there were 534 votes between them. Under normal circumstances, the state would have continued counting those votes. The district court or the 11th Circuit would have made a judgment as to whether those results were accurate, and then, if necessary, the Supreme Court would have intervened. I would argue that that decision not to take a different tact, which would have made a difference as 2 other justices were prepared to vote on this issue, but ultimately was a 5-4 decision. And I would argue that that hurt the Supreme Court, but more importantly, it also hurt the American people. One of the results of that election was for the those involved and those who were not involved to determine it was important to now have a Help America Vote Act so that we could avoid these problems in the future. I would love to report that the act worked, and the Election Administration Commission that followed has been able to do all of the things we had hoped, but that's not the case. And one of the unfortunate effects of the act is that it encouraged us to focus on voter ID as somehow a solution to this problem that had occurred in the 2000 election. Now we fast forward, we had other cases from the Supreme Court. There was the Crawford versus Marion County in Indiana, where the court approved more stringent voter ID requirements, which many have argued have had the effect of hurting the ability of Americans of different races and different ages to participate fully in the election process. Beyond that, we had the 2013 Shelby versus Holder case, in which the court, again on a 5-4 basis, determined that the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of 1965, was no longer relevant, and therefore Congress needed to come up with a amendment to that act. By removing the pre-clearance requirement, it encouraged states across the country who wanted to suppress the vote to do so. And it's against that backdrop that we now look at the current situation where we have a pandemic that literally means you're putting your life in your hands if you leave your house to go vote in person. And there were 4 challenges over the course of the spring primaries. All went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court turned them all down and basically said, we're not going to change anything, even though clearly the seriousness and the deadliness of the coronavirus would have suggested otherwise. There's been a lot of talk about mail-in ballots and are they safe and are they secure? I would argue that every study over the last 20 years on that point have demonstrated that mail-in voting is extremely secure. And I would argue, given the election interference by foreign nations in our elections in 2016, and to be expected again in 2020, that we're safer these days with mail-in ballots than any other form, including in-person voting. And I say that in part because of what happened in Georgia, where people had to stand in line up to 7 hours just to cast their vote in terrible temperatures, but in part because the state had implemented brand new machines without adequate training and without the ability to manage those machines in real time. So I want to start there and then pivot a little bit to how does COVID relate to this, and how should we be approaching the upcoming election as individuals, as families, as communities. I want to go back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was passed only after a major situation that happened in Alabama in the march from Selma to Montgomery. John Lewis, his funeral was here in Washington yesterday and the day before, and he's now lying in state in Georgia. He was one of the people first in the line attacked by, oh, there goes my light, attacked by the police. And I just wanted to acknowledge his courage and commitment to the effort to make a more perfect union throughout his 80 years. But it's also, I think, an important time for us to realize that we are now at a very pivotal moment. We have to figure out how best we can face this challenge. And against that backdrop, I'll now turn it over to Nicole and Charles.
Thanks, Sonia. And I think, and we have one question that we'll come back to after we've done the presentations. I think Don is next, and so Don, introduce yourself and take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Don. I'm a faculty member at the Marxe School. We're very excited that you're all here tonight. I have a few things I want to underscore. The first is that I hope you leave this session mad. You should be mad at what is going on in this country. Two quick things. I agree with Spencer Overton that right now, the state of play with voting in the United States is that people don't pick the politicians pick the voters. We have gerrymandered districts that have been described as like a bug splat on a windshield. So hyper gerrymandered that in terms of sort of partisan interests that have been squelching one person, one vote. So I want to get into a little bit, if we can't get voting right, what can we get right is my fundamental question. This issue is at the core of so many different issues that we might be interested in. For my own part, I'm actually much more interested in developing robust forms of civic engagement, getting citizens to talk to each other. But about 3 years ago, I was confronted with some evidence about voting, these voter ID laws, and with Nicole and Sonia, we got really interested in doing research around this. So a few things. First of all, in this country, getting people to vote is difficult enough, right? That's a big barrier, just getting people to the polls to vote. Add to that, you got to register to vote, right? Which is the biggest barrier to voting in the United States. In 2016, 100 million people, approximately 42% of the nation, did not go to the polls, did not vote. I heard somebody say today even did not vote would have won the election in 2016 if that were its own category. Now what we have from 2013 forward, given the Supreme Court decision I think Sonia mentioned, where states no longer have to seek pre-clearance from the federal government for any changes in their voting rights laws. They don't have to seek that oversight anymore. They can basically almost do what they want with voting. Now that that's been knocked out, the states are all doing their own voting laws, and we have pre-registration requirements such as go get your birth certificate and pull up a driver's license, and right, all these different requirements by different states to even just register to vote. 3 big barriers along the way to voting. And it's not fair, it's not equal. Each state is doing its own thing. Just to give you all an example, in Texas, you can vote with a gun permit, but not with a student ID. So it becomes very clear these laws are often being written in the interests of the policymakers within each state. We went out for about a year all over the United States and did research. We did focus groups, we did surveys, got 200 community members across the 10 strictest voter ID states. We did an audit of 150 elections offices across the 10 strict voter ID states to see what that experience would be like. We acted as citizens calling the election office saying, what do I need to get to register to vote? And if you're like me, you've ever called Sprint and you get through to somebody and they say, oh, go somewhere else. Again, no, that's not my job, right? That's what it was like calling a lot of elections offices. People didn't know in Wisconsin that the law had just changed sometimes and there were new ID requirements. In North Dakota, we've seen proof of residence requirements that suppressed the votes of many Native American communities within North Dakota. The laws are just all over the place. So we've titled our project States of Confusion because the thing that we found most from citizens all over the United States, eligible voters, was people are confused by all these variations all over the place. The states have sovereignty with voting right now, and they create voting laws in their own images. So this has all sort of led us to a fundamental question. Why should a citizen of this country, any person, have a different experience voting than somebody else? Why should those experiences be unequal? If we believe in one person, one vote, that should not be the case. So I just want to show you a little bit. This is from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. This is a map of what happened. 2016 general election was the first one in the United States in 50 years without the protections of the Voting Rights Act Section 5 pre-clearance requirements. So just look at this map right here. These, in 2013, when the states could do really whatever they wanted to with voting, you'll see right here, all these states started putting in effect a lot of kind of voter ID laws, things like that. We saw voter purges. And one thing this correlates with is the demographic changes in the United States, the election victories of Obama. Very clearly, these laws were intended to suppress minority votes. We see college students sort of knocked off the voter rolls, crossing different states. We could get into that a little bit more. But I want to go down here just to show you, because the Brennan Center did a wonderful job of showing, this was 2004. This was states with strict photo ID laws in effect 2004 and before. We move over here. This is 2008. This is 2012. And this is 2016. And it's only gotten worse since then. And these are all the states, as the Brennan Center identifies, that have a lot of these states used to have these pre-clearance requirements. They were had to seek the federal government's approval and oversight to change their voting laws. All right, let me exit out of here for a moment. So in the pandemic, we've seen this what was kind of a quiet issue for a while, really surface publicly. In Alabama, for instance, absentee voting was made available, but you would often have to have a notary or two witnesses sign off on this and a copy of a photo ID before you could get registered to vote, during a time when the government offices that supplied the photo IDs were closed. So that's just one example of how these types of voter suppression have occurred. We keep seeing over and over again at the highest level of administration in this land, Trump, even a few weeks ago, put out a tweet that voter fraud is rampant. What we need is strong ID. These laws seem innocuous. They seem like they're there to maintain election integrity, but what they in effect do, what our research has shown and the research of many other people, is they function to exclude. We saw the results in the 2016 election across many minority groups as well as a result of these laws. So we can get much further into this, but this is what Sonia, Nicole, and I have been working on, and we will get more into the COVID-19 and coming election parts of this now.
Great. Well, thanks, Don. And Nicole, it's on to you. And you need to unmute yourself. So you should be good.
All right, am I unmuted now?
You're good.
I'm good. Okay. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the backdrop of election administration for the purpose of this discussion. As Don was alluded to in the work we've done, what we found was a vast disparity among jurisdictions about how people what they have to do in order to vote. And we also found a lot of inconsistency, even within a particular jurisdiction, of what people were able to find out from their elections boards and employees of the election apparatus. And I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, what we're looking at in this country, we have really vast dysfunction in the whole elections apparatus. And when you see why that is, you can understand that there are these problems we have grown out of a system that was never intended, never built to be a coherent system. We have a federal government, of course, at the top, which actually has very little to do with the day-to-day question of how people vote. It's very much a matter left to state law and state administration. And then even within the state, we go down to the county level for boards of elections that are charged with doing the actual work. And we have over 3,000 of those across the United States. And then, of course, you get even down to smaller levels. Even a polling place may do things differently from the way another polling place does. And it really is sort of not intended necessarily this way, but it really is a reflection of that crazy quilt that we have no consistency. And of course, it's very different, by the way, in other countries. You know, you're basically born with your registration card and you carry it with you, and it's not a matter of having to gather documentation or that the rules are different in one place from another. It's very different. And by the way, there are other ways in which we're very different from other functioning democracies. In Australia, you're required to vote. There isn't a problem without voter participation. You're required to vote, and you'll be fined if you don't, with very narrow exceptions. And it's the job of the government to worry about registered voters and keeping track of them and performing census and so on. Here we have the parties and nonpartisan groups going to register voters. That's not thought to be the role of those entities in other places. You know, leaping from the fact that Board of Elections are chronically underfunded, that they're very often political appointees, and all the problems that they face with machinery and so on, it's just worth noting that when elections officials greet each other, they often say to someone who's about to administer an election in a given jurisdiction, said, "I hope you have a landslide." And the reason they say that is that, first of all, of course, it justifies the system in a way that makes it unquestionable, and you don't have to worry about the details of what went wrong or didn't go wrong. People will generally accept the outcome. But it's not a healthy way, obviously, to think about these things. And it sort of leads us right to the question of absentee ballots and how we're going to hope for an accurate count and how important that is. If you go back to the Bush-Gore election, as Sonia alluded to, it was between 500 and 600 votes that mattered at the end of where the whole process was cut off. At that time, there were 2,400 absentee ballots from overseas sailors and diplomatic personnel that had come in after Election Day. And it has, in the past, in general, it's not thought that votes that come in after Election Day should be counted. But they had been counted. And 1,600 of those were for Bush and 800 were for Gore. And if you had taken those out of the vote, 263 votes, by 263 votes, Gore would have been the winner. Now, there were dozens of lawsuits that were brought at the time about various aspects of the Florida elections, but it does tell you how close that election really was, and how crazy to even think that an election could be won by that small number of people when you have a voting public that is tens of millions of people. So from that point, I just want to pass on to the question of the accuracy and the security of absentee ballots. As Sonia had said, there has been a lot of talk about voter fraud in general, which is, according to all the studies, is really almost non-existent, and certainly in-person fraud, pretending to be a voter pretending to be somebody else, is just almost unheard of. If you look at the White House website, which has a page devoted to the Heritage Foundation's survey of decisions, criminal convictions for various voting fraud cases. You can put in, I just recently put in a filter asking for absentee, asking for voter fraud by impersonation of another person. And there are about a little bit over 30 cases over several years throughout the whole country that fell in that category. It's just really not a real story, but it's been spun now to such a degree that the public believes it. And which is a real shame, but it's also ironic that it's come now into the absentee ballot area, because now we're expecting a huge influx of absentee ballots. And there has been talk by the president and others that absentee ballots are inherently flawed or fraudulent. And now the irony is that in the Republican Party, they're having a mixed message about this, because it turns out that absentee ballots don't favor one party or the other, as far as we've been able to learn from the social science. And unfortunately, the public's confidence in this whole process is being very severely undermined. So on that very up note, I would just suggest that the real challenge in this coming election is going to be the job of counting the absentee ballots. We've seen right here in New York that recently in Carolyn Maloney's race, where she is the incumbent, it was a closer race than a lot of people expected. Over 50% of the vote was by absentee ballot. And it's been a month, and it seems in the last couple of days that it's pretty clear that she is the winner, but it has been a delay. And what they were looking at was 400,000 absentee ballots, when in the past they're used to dealing with 23,000, which is a huge burden for the Board of Elections and for the people who count the votes, obviously. Having said that, I saw somebody had a comment about, why should we allow for delay? Why don't we need to get an answer quickly to the results of elections? And I would say to that, and Bush against Gore is a good example, but a little delay is perhaps warranted when you want to get the right answer. And I've never understood why why Gore, for example, was put under so much pressure to concede when so much was in doubt, because people were in a rush to know the answer in November. The president doesn't get sworn in until mid-January, so why wouldn't we wait to get it right rather than push to get a certain answer, given that it was certainly uncertain? Anyway, with that background, I'll just cede the floor to Charles.
All right. Well, thanks, Nicole. I'm the interloper here. I'm, I was asked to kind of clean up by talking a little bit about, continuing the discussion of voting amidst the COVID. And so I thought I would clean up by talking about what we've been seeing in this current primary season, and then talk a little bit about what it might portend for November. And so to do that, I'm going to hopefully share my screen in a way that that eventually will and someone can tell me if there's actually really a screen up there that says voting during COVID-19. My colleagues will nod their heads.
Yes.
We think we're good. Being from MIT, I do feel compelled to have a few slides, and so I will. I will take advantage of the fact that I'm the moderator and have the floor to do a little shameless shilling just for a moment. We're here to, in part, celebrate and learn from a book project, and we'll get back to that. But I do want to bring the audience's attention to a project that I'm leading up in my role as the director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. I've partnered with my colleague and friend Nate Pursley, a law professor out at Stanford, for something called the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. And you can find that by going to healthyelections.org. We have a lot of information there about voting in time of COVID, particularly after action reports written about what's been going on in the various states as states have struggled to get to basically keep the voting going during the pandemic, both qualitative case studies and then also some quantitative analysis of the effects of the various interventions that have been made, the closing of polling places in Milwaukee, for instance, or we analyze the fact that voter registration rates have, voter registration is essentially stopped in many states. There's a lot of things going on, and you can find out about that at the Healthy Elections site. There's also a lot of tools in this on this website where that we are making known to the world. Many election officials know about these, but we're trying to discuss further in terms of research and tools to help voters vote safely in person and by mail. So, I mean, we all know, and I'm just gonna say just a few words, but we all know that there are really two imperatives in voting in this time of COVID-19, and they're really tied together. One is this retaining opportunities for in-person voting and yet de-densifying them. It's important to retain in-person voting because there are a number of people who need in-person voting. There are a number of people who will not be able to navigate the requirements to request absentee ballots. There are people who just don't trust the postal service. There are people with certain physical disabilities or language needs who need assistance of the sort you can really only get in person. And so there's a need for in-person voting, but for public health, we need to de-densify. And therefore, there's a real need to expand voting by mail. And for public health, particularly, this is the challenge that we face. The graph I'm showing is a graph of the percentage of votes cast going back to 1996, every 2 years up until 2018, the percentage of votes nationwide that are cast. And the blue line in person on election day, the red line is by mail, and the gold line is early before in person, but at an early votes center. And you see over the last 20 years, so since roughly at Bush v. Gore and a little before, back then 80% of America was voting on election day. About 8% was voting by mail, all traditional absentee voting, and a very small fraction, about 3%, 2 to 3% were voting in person, but early. Over time, mail balloting and early voting have gradually increased, while in voting on election day has fallen. But so in 2016, it was about 60% voted on election day, about 20% voted by mail, and about 20% voted early in person. A number of things to say about this. One of them is this. Many states are turning on a dime to up their game on mail balloting. And in 2020, I'm estimating that we will have between 50 and 70% of people voting by mail. You don't see anything near such a change anywhere in the historic period of such a magnitude. So we're looking at tremendous change that election administrators are trying to institute on a dime in just a few months, trying to undertake changes that some states like Washington, Oregon, Colorado that have been voting by mail for years and decades have taken decades to achieve. Election administrators right now are trying to achieve these changes in weeks and months. And if you want to kind of see where the big challenges are going to be, this map helps to kind of illustrate the lay of the land and how geographically these challenges will play out. There's basically, you can put states right now in 4 buckets in terms of how easy it is to vote by mail. The states that are blue are states where you can vote by, you can vote absentee, but you need an excuse. And usually that means you need to be out of town or infirm. And it's relatively hard in these states. And New York is one of these, although New York actually has changed during the pandemic. But you can see these states that make it really hard. The red states are the no excuse states, where you don't need an excuse to vote absentee, but nonetheless, you still have to apply to get an absentee ballot. And oftentimes you have to apply with every election. So both the red and the blue states, you usually have to, at least red and blue in this map, you have to apply for an absentee ballot. The legal regime says that voting by mail is a convenience, and the voter assumes all of the risks of voting by mail in these states because it's a convenience. It's not a right. And this has been a challenge in many of these states. And these are the states where really we're going to see this enormous surge of voters voting by mail, where they haven't before. But one of the nuances that I would mention in the spirit of making people angry and kind of freaked out, if that's one of the goals, is that because the legal regimes are such in the many of the red and blue states, that absentee mail balloting is convenience, not a right. There are practices that have grown up to make it hard to get the ballot cast, particularly kind of loose and lax and oftentimes not well understood screening mechanisms to screen out ballots because of mismatches on signatures, etc. Again, New York right now in the slow counting, part of the slow count is due to the fact that New York has a number of archaic requirements for an absentee ballot to be accepted, and that's causing a large number of ballots to be rejected. And so there's that issue, and that particular issue is going to be played out nationwide in the fall if states don't change their practices around accepting and rejecting absentee ballots. The gold states and the blue and the green states are the ones that are in a little better position. The green states are states that have had have a permanent absentee list. And New Jersey has just added, joined the green states. Montana and Arizona have permanent lists. 60 to 80% of voters in those states are already voting by mail. Not a big change. And then the gold states are the states that have all vote by mail. They will be mailing a ballot to all registered voters, all active registered voters in those states. And I'd be happy to take questions and say some more things about the safeguards in those states as they mail out to everybody. But the states that we are worried about as we make the pivot are not the gold states. It's really the red and the blue states in this map that are doing something they've never done before. The last thing I will say, and I tend to be a bit more moderate than many people in this certainly on this panel and even in the field of election administration. But one of the things I just have to say, having just raised this issue of the different states doing different things, is that President Trump and Attorney General Barr has recently been trying to make this fine distinction between absentee voting, which they have been doing, and mail voting, in which you have to mail ballots to everybody. And I will just say that Washington, Oregon, Colorado, who have been doing this the longest, are by far the cleanest run elections in this country. There may be a few other states that are just as clean. And in part because they take seriously the issues of fraud and administrative snafus that can get in the way of the system working. And they worked hard on this. And so it's exactly wrong to say that voting by mail is somehow inherently corrupt and that voting absentee is fine. There are problems all along, and I will give credit to the vote by mail states for taking these issues seriously. The red and the blue states are beginning to have to take these issues seriously, and they're scrambling around that. So, by the way, just a couple more things, and then we'll turn it back over to the panelists. If people are are interested in thinking about how this map overlays with the battleground states, you'll see by and large the battleground states are actually the ones that have no excuse absentee balloting, and so they're already kind of set up to have larger number of absentee ballots, mail ballots, and so that's kind of a good sign. Having absentee ballots is not as mysterious for them as it is for the blue states. The other thing that I'll just note is that Americans have been flocking to absentee voting and mail voting in this election. What this graph shows is the blue dots for these are states, all the states for which we can get the data, the percentage of ballots that were cast by mail in 2016 in the primaries. Those are the blue dots. The red dots are the percentage of ballots cast by mail in 2020. And I'm showing you the states right now that voted before the mid-March. And you can see by and large, most states had a really low usage rate of mail balloting before the pandemic hit. There's a couple of exceptions, California, Michigan, Florida, Arizona. These are all states that for one reason or the other were already moving in a direction toward, without COVID, to do more vote by mail. So really their movements to COVID, to vote by mail were not related to COVID. Then the pandemic hit, and this is what this looks like now. That state after state after state, we've had multiples of 5, 7, 10 times more mail ballots used in the various states. So lots of mail ballots are being used. Another interesting thing that we're discovering in this election is that people are turning out to vote. We've been worried about people staying away from the polls, and they're not because of the pandemic, and they're not. So this graph, and this is where I'll end, is maybe a bit difficult to parse out, but let me explain to you this kind of piece of modern art that's on your screens right now. The blue dots show turnout in the presidential elections and the Democratic primaries that have been held this spring. These are all the states for which we can get data, and all the states which had primaries in 2020 and in 2016. The dots show turnout in 2016 as a percentage of, turnout in 2020 as a percentage of turnout in 2016. So if you're above 100%, and there's a horizontal line, you had more turnout in 2020 than you did 4 years ago. If you're below, you had less. Pay attention to the Democratic turnout to begin with, because that's where the competition has been. On average, before the pandemic hit, turnout was above where it was in 2016. In April, for Wisconsin and Ohio, in the midst of the pandemic, and really kind of last minute changes in those states, turnout dipped, but turnout has been restored in the primaries in May and June. So the two takeaways that I would leave you with, which are in the kind of the hopeful category, and thinking about, well, we all have to have a little bit of hope, is that the two things are that despite the problems of voting in the spring, Americans have turned out to vote. It hasn't been pretty always, and there are certainly places where underserved communities have been doubly underserved, and the rest. But Americans are showing a willingness and an eagerness to turn out and vote. The electorate is mad, and they want to demonstrate their anger. And the second thing is that Americans are figuring out how to vote by mail. Again, it hasn't always been pretty. There's a lot of places where it can improve, and it should improve. But nonetheless, the first tranche suggests that Americans, when it comes between their health and exercising the franchise, they're figuring out how to exercise the franchise and stay healthy. And I mean, I think that that's at least a modicum of good news in thinking about what's going to happen in November, despite the fact, as we've already heard, and I absolutely take seriously everything that's been said before, there are real serious problems and issues that need to be addressed in voting in general in the United States, and will be a factor in voting in 2020. So having said those, I want to turn the floor back over to Sonia to wrap up with some wrap-up comments, and then we will get to some questions.
Thank you, Charles. I guess what based on the comments we've shared with the audience so far and some of the questions we've been reading on the chat line, I think it's important for us to remember that the right to vote is something that we've been fighting for since the Constitution was ratified. Race has always been an issue when talking about who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote. We have also recognized that while making progress over time, especially with the National Voter Registration Act of '93, that people were generally feeling it was easy to vote. You get your driver's license, you register at the same time or when you're in a government office. But now we're seeing restrictions. And so voter suppression is not new. Before it was the Democrats who made sure that Black people couldn't vote at all. Didn't like Latino people either. Certainly didn't like Asians. But over time that changed. And we ultimately were able to get to the Voting Rights Act. But since then, we're now seeing an effort, a concerted effort, to make it more difficult to vote. Why should a student not be able to use their identification to vote? But if you're in certain states, your gun license will serve as your identification. That just doesn't make any sense to me, but it's what's happening. Beyond that, to John's point about one person, one vote, we'd like to feel that that's still our standard, but we're seeing challenges to that when, for example, the National Voter Registration Act said that you cannot be removed from the rolls for missing an election. Yet in the recent Ohio case, the court, Supreme Court, 5-4, again said, oh yes, you can. What happened to conservatives being concerned about what the law actually said? I'll just raise that for a moment. But beyond that, to take points that Nicole had offered in terms of administration, the people who very often run our elections right now are seniors, and they're at risk from the pandemic. So they're not necessarily showing up in the numbers that we've seen before, yet some of the states have gone overboard in like closing all of the precincts and having only one place where you can go vote. So we're seeing, again, against this backdrop, inconsistencies, which all go back to the original point that states were left to run our elections because of the compromise over slavery. And this reckoning, this national reckoning of the continued effects of racist and white supremacist policies are coming to fore at exactly the time we're in the midst of this pandemic. We've got a census that could be delayed, which will affect redistricting. And so I'll end by saying, I think this is clearly one of the most important elections in my lifetime. And if we're talking over the span of time, the only one that could be more important was the one in 1864, re-electing Abraham Lincoln. But it's now up to us to take Charles and his wonderful research, his point. We do have choices, and we still can make this a referendum on the current occupant of the White House, but even more importantly, what our nation stands for going forward. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thanks to all the panelists. Thank you, Sonia, and the other panelists for your comments. We have an awful lot of questions, and I will try to play traffic cop here in trying. I don't know that we'll be able to get to all of them, but we're trying to sample into the various topics that have arisen. Actually, I'm going to go right back to Sonia on to riff a bit on a question that came up during Sonia your comments, which had to do with the Bush v. Gore case and a little bit of a challenge there about how the parties didn't. It was the parties who brought the case, et cetera, and the court could have said no. And so, if you can say a few words about that, but there's the court is still sitting there, which you've mentioned several times. And what's your sense about this current court looking forward to what could very well be not just one state, but maybe several states in play, and its willingness to take on and intervene in say, vote count controversies that may arise, let's say, simultaneously in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, something like that.
Sure. I guess I would start by saying that with Bush versus Gore, what was so unusual about the case is that there were allegations that minority voters were prevented from voting and had difficulty casting their ballots in person. We didn't have a pandemic to deal with. We were just dealing with the normal crazy. And against that backdrop, the Attorney General of the United States could have intervened and said, let's lock up all of the ballot boxes and let's count them. And there would have been a single count. Everybody would have known what that count was, and then the question of certification would have followed. But that's not what happened because the Attorney General at that time, Janet Reno, decided not to intervene. But instead, the Supreme Court intervened clearly anywhere from a month to 3 weeks earlier than it needed to. It did not allow the 11th Circuit to make a ruling. So it violated its own normal process in reaching a partisan result. A lot of studies following that have shown that the Supreme Court's reputation among the public suffered from that decision. And I would argue it was because it wasn't signed, it was per curiam, 5 justices. We don't know who wrote the opinion. Actually, we do, but we pretend like we don't. And we also, out of that, got to this point of now opening the door to a frontal attack on the Voting Rights Act. To your point and question about where are we right now, I'm very concerned that the Supreme Court's Shelby decision was just the beginning of trying to limit the 15th Amendment, which the Voting Rights Act is based on. That's the amendment that says you have a right to vote and it shall not be infringed on the basis of race. But our Chief Justice has a history of being anti-Voting Rights Act from his days as a clerk. I mean, it goes back that far. So I'm not surprised he has not been willing or interested in helping citizens get to the polls or use alternate means during this pandemic. I think his record is part of the problem here, even though as part of his hearing to become a justice, he said Supreme Court judges should act as referees and not as players. I think that we can look at what's happened over time and we see that consistently when there's a choice, the choice is to restrict rights, not to expand rights.
As a moderator, I need to remember to unmute myself. Thanks very much, Sonia. I wanted to direct a question to Nicole and Don, and actually Sonia as well, about the question of voter ID, which you know is in the title of the symposium here, and to ask you all to say a bit specifically about what's happening in 2020. You know, I'm somebody who's thinks he keeps track of voter ID laws. I've back in the good old days of pre-clearance, I worked for the Justice Department as an expert for the United States of America in some of these voter ID cases. So I like to think that I know something what's going on, but what strikes me is that really all talk of voter ID has just kind of vanished. And I know that there's some new you know, some new things happening in this world. And so if y'all could just say something specifically about this interaction of voter ID laws, particularly new ones that might be coming on board, new implementations of voter ID laws, and how that's interacting with the limitations that COVID's bringing. So I'll let anyone jump in there. but maybe more, I'm looking more at Don than the others.
Sure. So Vote Writers, citing another source, had a thing of the 25 million eligible voters are affected by voter ID laws, about 11% of people. It seems, in theory, it sounds like, oh, just go get an ID, right? But there are really people in this country who don't drive. They don't want to drive anymore. Many elderly people, for instance, have, they've moved across states and suddenly discovered that they need a driver's license or a document like that to get registered to vote. And then there's deadlines in the way, right? The deadlines also are a big part of this. So when you push on voter ID, what you end up seeing is this thicket of issues open up, right? And then you cross into Wisconsin and all of a sudden they're saying, well, you need a birth certificate, and you get what some participants described to us in our research as a circular trap, where you go to a government office to get one thing. I need my birth certificate, right? And they say, well, show us a driver's license. You go, well, that's why I'm here. And one begets the other, and you're caught in the middle. Coronavirus, COVID-19, has only amplified this issue with government offices being closed. So right now, and then with deadlines looming especially, right? So you've got, if you want to do early voting, you got to check those deadlines. And there's just these kind of arbitrary lists in many states of what are required to vote. We say, make it all equal. I can't tell you the number of times, and I think somebody had this in the chat box, we heard in our research, people just say, why can't I supply the last 4 of my social? Like, right, I'll tell you all, my mom died 3 years ago. The rapidity with which the entire electronic system in the United States knew that her credit card should be canceled, her social security check should be cut off. It was so fast, it had me wonder, like, why do we have a system that is opt-in to voting? It needs to be opt-out, period. Oregon, you said, is a great example that has automatic voter registration. Great, let's get rid of these barriers to voting, take it away, it's opt-out. And one of the solutions been come up with recently is universal civic duty voting. The Kennedy School, in consortium with a bunch of others, had this, which is, why don't we have a system that's like jury duty? It's actually a duty to go vote, right? And you can always write what you want and not vote when you put in your ballot. But I think the entire system should be opt-out. Right now, this opt-in stuff during a pandemic is just amplifying all these issues for people who can't get in a car in West Texas, drive 40 miles to the DMV. It's only open during working hours, so you have to ask your boss for time off of work, perhaps, or that you're gonna go do this, right? It's suddenly the thicket of issues just starts to spread. Nicole, I know you're quite on all the pandemic issues as well with absentee and ID in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty grim picture in a lot of ways, and it also relates to what Sonia was saying about the courts. You have these crazy situations in some places, and Don, you alluded earlier to the Kentucky rule of having 2 witnesses or a notary to allow you to do an absentee ballot, and the governor is going to vote that way, but she won't relax the rules for anybody else during a time of coronavirus. And you think about people, particularly in the most marginalized communities, how are they going to get a notary or 2 witnesses to come, I guess, into their houses or someplace where it's safe for all 2 or 3 of these people to do something like that? And it's pretty dispiriting to see how it gets treated in the judicial system, because you would kind of think that in a time, I mean, we've never been in a time like this. You think in a time of coronavirus, there'd be more excitement about making sure that people had the opportunity to vote and that they could do it safely, and a little less excitement about trying to give the most onerous requirements to the day, the win of the day. So, yeah, I think it's very grim.
Right. Thanks. Actually, while we're on this interaction of COVID and barriers to voting, we've gotten a couple questions about, and I'll just more or less read it, but about kind of the interaction between the increase in absentee voting due to COVID and how it relates to voter suppression. I mean, is the mail voting um, helpful for suppression, harmful to suppression? How do we think about this movement to vote by mail for those of us who are worried about voter suppression?
I'll take that. I think the best way to look at it is what's happening with the post office. Let's start there. President Trump installed someone who has some built-in conflicts in terms of his regular business as opposed to being Postmaster General. And according to the union that represents postal workers, they've been told that overtime is being canceled during this time when some of their workers can't make it to work because they're sick from the virus. So we've got that concern going on right now. And some of you out there may have experienced slower mail than normal. So we've got to worry about that issue on top of everything else. I know there was an effort in the first CARES bill concerning funding related to COVID to give the Postal Service extra money because they were already at a deficit. And so far, no additional funds have been allotted to the Postal Service. I think we have to demand from our Congress that they provide those funds so that if anyone does use mail-in, their ballot will be received in time. Otherwise, you will see individual rules that say, oh, you might have mailed it 2 weeks ago, but we didn't get it on election day, therefore we're not going to count it. So we've already got that issue to worry about. But I'm also worried about, again, this is one of those offshoots of this greater problem. Of all of our federal agencies, the post office is the second in terms of the most number of minority workers. So is this attack on the post office about that too? I'm just raising it as a possibility. I'd like to think that it is simply incompetence, but I think it has a purpose, which is to allow an excuse for an election result that someone might not like. So I think we have to be concerned about that.
Nicole, Don, you have anything? I do actually. I have one thing to add, just as a point of information, which I think is important. It just has to do with the Postal Service standards, and Sonia was kind of referencing how services degraded in part by kind of underinvestment and basically fundamental challenges to the post office. And that is, I mean, people should recognize that if the mail is going according to plan, you should allow for 3 to 5 days for a first class piece of mail to travel. And that you should expect even longer for what used to be called bulk mail, now called marketing mail, to move. And most absentee ballots, especially when they're the big tranche that's pushed out right at the beginning, those big bundles go out on marketing mail. So if you kind of think about this, especially if you're in a state that doesn't have an absentee ballot online portal, or if you're unable to access an online portal, you'll need to either call in or mail in a request. That request, if it doesn't get rejected, is going to take 3 to 5 days, up to 3 to 5 days to get to the elections office. It'll take them a day or two to process it. They'll send back a ballot that could take a couple of days. It could take a week or two to get to you and be within Postal Service standards. And then you'll take a day or so to mark it, and then you'll put it back in the mail. And again, it might get to the other end in a day or two, but it would not be considered late if it arrives in 3 to 5. And so depending on kind of where you are, et cetera. When you put all those numbers together, you need to be decided about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the election that you're going to vote by mail. And so for the people, it's probably too late to fundamentally fix the postal service in the next few weeks. And so, you know, we have the postal service that we have. And so for people who are considering voting by mail, you know, apply online if you can, by phone if you can, quick ways, and do it early. And actually, if you can, if you're in a state that allows you to return the ballot to a drop box or someplace like that, consider doing that. There are ways of overcoming the inherent delay in mail balloting. But again, I mean, it puts burdens on voters that, you know, some people think shouldn't be there. So, so there you go. A public service announcement. I want to kind of shift a little bit. We've been talking about the challenges to the system, and Don encouraged us to be mad, and presumably madness or anger is useful if it's turned to action. So, and all of you, I know Nicole, Don, and Sonia have been active. So what are your favorite ways to, what are the good groups to be engaged with right now that can make a difference in the next 99, 98 days before the election in dealing with some of these issues to make sure that the election comes out, et cetera?
I'm going to just throw in a thought before people get into specific organizations, if I may. It has seemed as though there are going to be so many states that have a problem dealing with an influx of absentee ballots they've never dealt with. I don't know this for sure, but I'm imagining there's going to be a call for people to participate in the work of counting the ballots. And it would seem to me that people, for example, at the Marxe school, would be perfect candidates to be engaged in that kind of a process to get it right and to do it fairly. So it's just a different new area. We've had poll workers in the past, of course, who do the in-person work, and they make a resounding $200 for a 16-hour day, which is really pretty interesting in the state of New York. And they don't get trained very well, and it's a tough job. But I just think this is an opportunity for people to do a civic duty that is really important and timely.
Actually, I will underscore that too. Kind of poll working. Poll working is a good thing to do, especially if you feel like you're not put at risk. Don and Sonia, I'll give you all an opportunity to talk about what's the best use of people's time over the next 90 days or so to mitigate some of these issues and make a difference.
I want to get this is something that came off of our project. So everybody who's still on this call, this is something you can do. I challenge you to do this. It's not too heavy of a lift. First of all, get your pre-registration requirements in place. Whatever you need to get registered to vote, get that. Get registered to vote and vote early. So first of all, take care of yourself. It's that old put your mask on first thing. I want to call this voting plus though. This election, find at least one other person. It could be your neighbor. It could be anybody, somebody from work, right? And just ask them if they're registered to vote, if they know the state's requirements for voting. You don't have to argue for or against any particular position, but just help one other person get what they need to vote. If everybody did that, we'd be much further ahead with the registration barriers alone. I also wanted to just add, because we are an institution of higher education, and Nicole and Charles, you may have seen this on the election law listserv. I just caught this yesterday. Perkins Coie put out a call to colleges in particular to provide a summary to all students about what the state's registration requirements are. Just say in this state, it's different than other states, here's what you need. And also in states like Wisconsin, where you might need an address confirmation, to actually send out those to students so that they can prove they have a residency, right? Just eliminating those barriers for folks. I think colleges and universities can do a lot, as well as saying you're gonna hold local elections boards and legislators accountable for what happens here, to go back to Nicole's point from earlier. But I just underscore voting plus. Everybody take care of yourself. Try to help one other person, and we're further ahead than we are.
All right. Sonia, I'll turn it to you.
Sure, thanks, Charles. I guess I would say a couple of things on that, and that is we've been gathering information from across the country about exactly that, those groups that are doing the real work on the ground. Of course, they all need money. Everybody needs money right now. So that's an issue. So if there's a group you're familiar with, support them so that they can do their outreach. The second thing is something that I'm posing for Marxe, our school, to do, and it's to post that list so that wherever you are in the country, you can come here and find out some place in your state that will provide you with the information if you're having trouble getting it. There are a number of umbrella groups, like the National Association of State Legislators. Their website is great. The Brennan Center at NYU, shout out to NYU, is also a place that you can get good information on voting. I would caution you to be very leery of anything that Facebook is talking about, not because I'm a hater, but because I'm still not comfortable with how they handled issues of misinformation in the 2016 election. And some of you may know there were hearings about those types of issues today with the major companies like Facebook and Twitter and Apple and somebody else. But anyway, my point was simply that the information is available, but getting a human to help you with that is something we ran into in just doing our span of the 10 hardest states in terms of voter ID. So I think to the extent that we can make the information available and easy for people to access, sure, we're all in the online world right now, but we also have folks who are not, and we also have to figure out a way to make sure they are included in this discussion. We reach out, whether individually, through our groups, through our sororities, through other churches, whatever it takes to make sure people know this is, in John Lewis's words, our most important election in a very, very long time. And I'd like to make sure that we're doing what we can to provide a bridge to that information.
Good. And I see some folks have put some groups in the chat, and if folks have, we can invite people if you know of groups and ways to be involved and active. The chat is there. There's also, you know, the traditional groups, the League of Women Voters, ACLU, et cetera. I will tell you why I have a soft spot in my heart for the League one day, but we don't have time for that. We've got a couple of questions about the census. I mean, this is in some ways kind of a bit of a pivot, but it's not a big pivot. You know, we're in the middle of a census, and there's been some news reports yet again that both President Trump's executive order about counting and difficulties in reaching people, as well as some supposition that actually the count might come to a close before everyone is in fact counted. So in terms of, for Nicole, Sonia, and Don, in terms of the things you think about with voter suppression and access and the rest, how does this relate to what's going on with the census these days?
Nicole, you want it first?
I guess it's just sort of more dispiriting news. So I'm a little shy to keep saying those things, but it's not been a great time for the census, and it's really for a multiplicity of reasons. Not only the negativity from Washington, but there happen to be some strange demographics that I saw in New York. I read recently that there's a deficit of people filling out the form because so many of them have moved out of the city temporarily, and so New York, as usual, will not get its appropriate count, but this time maybe for a somewhat different reason. But in general, I think the antipathy in Washington toward so many things that are really intended to be inclusive, to preserve people's rights of various kinds. And of course, it's not just about voting. I mean, it's funding at every level. It's what gets cut, what gets paid for. It looks like a pretty dispiriting picture.
Well, it certainly started out wrong with the Secretary of Commerce claiming that we needed to add a citizenship question to the census for the first time since 1950 because of the Voting Rights Act. I think I was more offended by that than any other reason they could have come up with, given how they're treating the Voting Rights Act. But aside from that, normally during the summer is when we do the follow-up to the first wave of census forms that go out. And this year was the first time we started the first wave of forms online. And that was before COVID, we even knew what COVID was. So we are only at about a 60% return rate so far. The counting is supposed to stop by October 1st. It may be extended. We'll have to wait and see. No one said anything about it. I guess we have too many other things in the way in the meantime. But I would urge anyone who can hear my voice to talk about the census and make sure that the people in your life have filled it out because of its importance. We need the numbers. We need the statistics. We've got it. We have it not only, it's important not only because of funding, but also so we can figure out who's being adversely affected by this pandemic in ways that we couldn't imagine before. And if we don't know who's out there, it's going to make it worse. But we also know from the 2010 census what happens when people don't fill out those forms. And gerrymandering and changing the rules becomes part of our world. We can turn that around, but it means filling out the forms. That's how important the census is, on top of everything else.
And I think Don was going to jump in.
Oh, my purpose tonight is just to make everybody furious. So I'm going to continue on that theme. I said pressing on voter IDs and these issues leads to other things. Felon disenfranchisement, big issue in this country. Look up Florida, what's happened there the past 2 years, where the state's citizens said, well, let's enfranchise our ex-felons, and then the legislature overturned it. Great, right? So much for representation. But one fact I just want to bring up for everybody, you might not know about this, just about counting particular bodies in places. Carol Anderson talks a lot about this. We should all be extremely mad. Where are most prisons in this nation? They're in typically white suburban areas where felons, they get counted for purposes of being in those counties. Those counties get funding from the government based on the bodies, but those folks don't get to vote in many states. In some states they do. I think it's Iowa, there's a couple. But this is a huge issue that's a form of voter suppression as well, connected to things like the census we should all be talking about and surfacing.
We also had a number of groups that were working on this issue, Don, but because of COVID, they had to stop the programs. There are a lot of people incarcerated who have not been tried yet. They can still vote. They haven't lost their right to vote, but they can't do it, well, for so many different reasons. And now COVID just made it more difficult for this outreach program that was really showing good results. And in Florida, that's been back and forth. We have to wait and see what the latest is, but clearly the people in Florida said, let those who have paid their debt to society vote. But the state said, no, we want to treat any outstanding fines you have as if it's a poll tax. Okay? I mean, that's really what it comes back to.
It's like voter ID. Yeah, it's poll tax.
It's another form of poll taxes. And how do we fight through that? By paying attention to it, by letting our members of Congress and state legislatures understand that it's time for us to address these issues that still have their roots in slavery. I mean, we could spend another session on just that, but I'll stop there.
So,
Well, if we're going to have that session, we will have to end this one in order to have that one. And so time has gone fast, and we are coming up to the end of the period for which we've rented these electrons in order to do this Zoom meeting. And I have been instructed that the last thing I will do is I will turn it back over to Nicole to say some words about future events. And so Nicole, you get the last word.
Thanks, Charles. We want to make sure everybody on this call knows that the next event in this Marxe series is on August 4th, and it's about COVID-19 in Latin America. And Don, I don't know if you said the name of the book that's coming out.
yeah, the book, Sonia, Nicole, and our book is called States of Confusion, The Crisis of Voter Identification and What to Do About It. It's currently under contract with NYU Press. We're hoping to get it out toward the end of the year. It may be after the election, though. So we'll email everybody here, let you know.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks especially Charles for coming all the way from Massachusetts.
Charles, we really appreciate it.
Those electrons had to move far, and I'd like to thank my colleagues down in New York for a great time, and the audience for sticking with us and for showing your interest. And to underscore what the panelists said, there's a lot of things to take action on. I will feed royal jelly to volunteer to be a poll worker if that's your thing. It's a good thing to do. And with that, everyone stays safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Charles.
all.
Goodbye.